Darkness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it builds a ranch, tends the chickens, waves at the neighbors. California, 1926. A dusty road, a coop full of birds, and beneath the ground, what no one on that road knew to look for. In this episode, we're stepping into a story that began with something small, something easy to overlook, until it wasn't anymore. We're gonna follow it from the beginning, through the moments that didn't raise alarm, and into what was left behind when everything finally came to light. If you're new here, welcome to Chasing the Dark. If you find yourself drawn to these stories that don't sit right, the ones that stay with you a little longer than they should, follow Chasing the Dark wherever you listen. And if you're already here, please leave a rating or a review. It helps more people find these stories and step into the dark with us. This episode contains psychological terror, the abduction of children, sexual assault, incest, and the murder of children. This isn't an easy one, so please listen with caution. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Now, close your eyes, let the room settle around you, and follow my voice into the dark. They call this the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders. Before Wineville, before the ranch, before any of the names you'll hear tonight, there was just a boy named Gordon. And I want to spend a little time there, not to explain him away, not to hand you some neat reason that makes the rest of this make any sense, because honestly there isn't one, but because people always ask the same question about men like this. What made him? What happened in his early life that turned him into such a vile monster? And honestly, I have no idea. I don't think anyone will truly have any idea why people like this do these horrific things. So let's start from the beginning. Gordon Stewart Northcott was born in November of 1906 in a small place called Bladworth in Saskatchewan, Canada. He grew up in British Columbia, and from the very beginning, by the accounts that survive, there was something about him that the people around him couldn't quite put their finger on. His own father would later describe him as an abnormal boy, both physically and mentally. And I want you to sit with this because it's a father saying it about his own son. That's not a stranger. That's not a prosecutor. That's the man who raised him. The Northcott household was not a healthy place. It was the kind of family where the dysfunction ran deep and old, the kind that gets passed down like an inheritance that nobody asked for. And right at the center of it was the woman Gordon knew as his mother, Sarah Louise. Except that may not have been the truth, because years later, when all of this came crashing into the courtroom, Sarah Louise stood up and told a story that turned the whole family inside out. She claimed she wasn't Gordon's mother at all, but she was his grandmother. She said that her own husband, Gordon's father, the man Gordon grew up calling Dad, had raped their daughter, a young woman named Winifred, and that Gordon was a child born from that. That Gordon's sister was really his mother, that his parents were really his grandparents, that the entire shape of his family was a lie built on top of one of the worst things a family can do. Were these allegations actually true? Honestly, I have no idea, because all of this information came out at trial from a woman who was, by every account, not a reliable witness. She told several different stories about Gordon's origins. At one point, she even claimed he was a secret son of an English nobleman. She would say almost anything if she thought it might save him. So is the incest story true? It's on his death certificate. It's been repeated for nearly a century, but it came from a source who lied as easy as she breathed. And maybe that's the point, because whether or not that specific story is true, it tells you everything about the world Gordon Northcott came up in. A world where the truth was whatever protected the family, where children were just things that happened to people, where the line between parent and predator had already been crossed long before Gordon was old enough to understand it. He told his own stories too, and they were dark ones. He claimed his own father had sodomized him when he was just 10 years old. He claimed the abuse didn't stop with his father either. He said that Sarah Louise, the woman who raised him, the woman he called mother, had carried on a sexual relationship with him for years. An incestuous one, going back to when he was just a boy. Now, can I prove any of that is actually true? No, and neither could anyone else, because every one of these claims came from the same two people, Gordon and Sarah Louise, and neither of them ever told the truth twice in a row. They accused each other, they contradicted themselves, they said whatever served them in the moment, so take it exactly for what it is, the word of a killer and the word of a woman who'd helped him. Abuse ran through that family like a current. Gordon may have been a victim of it before he ever became the worst thing it produced. And that's the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath a lot of these stories, that monsters are very often made out of children who were failed first. It doesn't excuse a single thing he did. Nothing could. The boys you'll hear about tonight had families who loved them, futures that were stolen, and they're the ones who deserve your grief. Gordon doesn't get to hide behind his own childhood. But if you want to understand who he was before that ranch, he was a estranged, damaged young man, shaped by a family that had already shown him cruelty was normal. And secrets were survival. There were signs too, the kind that look obvious only when you turn around and stare at them from the other end of the story. Even in Canada, before any of this, there were reports of unusual behavior around younger boys, a fixation that the people around him noticed and never acted on. By the time he was a teenager, the discomfort he created was already there, humming under the surface. But he was charming enough and confident enough and good enough at saying the right thing that it never quite became anything anyone stopped. That's a pattern you're going to see repeated throughout this episode. The feeling that something's wrong and the failure to do anything about it. It started early. In 1924, when Gordon was around 17, the family moved to Los Angeles. California was booming then. Orange groves and movie studios in the sense that you could become anything out west. And Gordon, by his early 20s, wanted something of his own. So in 1926, at just 19 years old, he convinced his father to buy him a piece of land out in a quiet farming community called Wineville. With his father's help, who was in construction, he built a house, and he built rows of chicken coops, and on paper, he became exactly what the town saw, a young man starting a poultry ranch. working the land, making something of himself. And that's the part that should send shivers down your spine, because he didn't look like the monster he was. He looked ambitious. He looked like a hard-working kid with a plan. A neighbor watching him hammer those coops together would have seen nothing but a young man building a future. But eventually he needed help there. Cheap help. Help that wouldn't ask questions and couldn't leave. And so that same year, he reached back to Canada, to his sister or mother, Winifred, and he convinced her to send her 13-year-old son out to California to live on the ranch, to work, to learn the trade like an apprentice, a family favor, a young boy going to help his uncle or brother build something. His name was Sanford Clark, and the moment that boy stepped onto the Wineville Ranch, everything we've been building toward begins. Because the chicken ranch wasn't going to be what Gordon Northcott told the world it was. It was never about the chickens. There are places that don't feel wrong at first. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't scream at you. They don't warn you. They sit quietly in the background of someone else's life, blending in with everything ordinary, until one day you realize something about them has been off the entire time. Wineville was one of those places. It wasn't meant to be anything more than a small agricultural settlement tucked into Riverside County, California. A place built upon dust and labor, rows of citrus trees stretching endlessly under a sun that never seemed to soften, chickens scratching through dry earth, wind that carried the smell of soil and heat. Nothing about it stood out. And maybe that's why no one noticed what was happening there. Or maybe they did notice, just not enough to act. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks, slowly. A boy doesn't come home. Another one vanishes a few weeks later. A family starts asking questions. And somewhere, in the distance, there's a farm with a man who always seems to have a reason, always has an explanation that sounds just believable enough to quiet the moment. Until the moment passes, until everyone moves on, until someone doesn't. And out there on that isolated stretch of land, the ranch sat quietly, doing exactly what it was built to do. Far enough from the eyes of the town, far enough that no neighbor was close enough to hear, because isolation has a way of hiding things. It gives people space to become who they really are without any interruption. And on that ranch, something had already taken shape. Something no one could see yet. The first disappearance didn't cause panic. Not immediately, because children wander, they get distracted, they follow something that catches their attention and they lose track of time. It happens. Everyone knows it happens. So when Walter Collins disappeared in 1928, it didn't register as something unnatural at first, just a missing boy. A search began. Questions got asked. Time passes. And then something strange happens. The boy comes back. Except he doesn't. When Christine Collins was told her son had been found, there was so much relief. That's the kind of news that doesn't leave room for any doubt. It doesn't make space for hesitation. It tells you everything is going to be okay. But when she saw him, she knew. that he wasn't her child. There's something instinctive about that kind of recognition, something deeper than logic. You don't need proof when you've carried someone, raised them, memorized the smallest details of who they are, and knows every curve of their face by heart. A mother knows, and she knew. But no one wanted to hear that, because the system had already decided the story was over. The boy was found, case closed. Except it wasn't, and Christine Collins refused to let it be. So that's where the cracks started to show. Not in Wineville, not yet, but in the story itself. Because when one person refuses to accept what everyone else is willing to believe, it forces the truth to shift, to move, to reveal itself in ways it hadn't before. Christine pushed, she questioned, she refused to take the answer she was given. And that refusal, it changed everything. Because somewhere else, miles away from Los Angeles, there was a boy who hadn't come back. A boy who had seen things. A boy who had survived something no one should ever have to survive. And when he finally spoke, the quiet town of Wineville would never be the same again. There's a certain kind of stillness that comes before something terrible is uncovered. It's not peaceful. It's heavy, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to surface. That stillness sat over Wineville for longer than anyone realized, long enough for things to happen without interruption, long enough for boys to disappear without anyone connecting the pattern, and long enough for Gordon Northcott to believe he would never be caught. Because when you operate in isolation, when your world is small and disconnected, you start to think you're untouchable, that no one's looking, that no one will ever find you. And for a while, he was right. But secrets don't stay buried forever. They shift, they rise, they find their way back into the light. And when this one did, it didn't come quietly. It didn't come gently. It tore through everything. Because the truth about Wineville wasn't just about one missing boy, or two, or even a handful. It was something darker, something layered, something that had been unfolding right beneath the surface of an ordinary place while life carried on around it. And when people finally saw it for what it was, they couldn't unsee it. And at the center of all of it was a ranch, a chicken coop, a man who'd been hiding in plain sight. We'll be right back after a quick word from today's sponsor. Nursing school doesn't wait for you to catch up. You're juggling clinicals, lectures, care plans, and somehow you're supposed to master pharmacology on top of all of it. That's where Farion comes in. Farion, spelled P-H-A-R-A-O-N, is an AI-powered tutoring platform built specifically for nursing students. Not a generic study app, not a chat box that doesn't know a beta blocker from a calcium channel blocker. Farion knows nursing, and it meets you exactly where you are. Ask it anything. Drug mechanisms, NC-LEX style practice questions, clinical reasoning, ECG rhythms, and get clear concept-driven answers instantly. Farion adapts to your gaps, not a one-size-fits-all curriculum. Whether you're prepping for the NC-LEX, surviving a brutal pharmacology block, or just trying to make it through finals week, Farion has your back. Start free at farion.app. That's P-H-A-R-I-O-N.app. AON.APP, because the patients you'll care for deserve a nurse who was ready. There's always one person who doesn't disappear, one voice that doesn't get buried, one thread that, when pulled, starts to unravel everything. In Wineville, that thread was a boy, and he wasn't supposed to make it out. By the time anyone outside that ranch knew his name, Sanford Clark had already lived through something that didn't leave room for childhood anymore. He was only a teenager, but the way he moved through the world after, the way he spoke, the way he hesitated, it didn't belong to someone his age, because whatever had been taken from those boys on that ranch, it hadn't just been their lives. It was something deeper than that. Something you can't measure. Something you don't get back. Sanford wasn't from Wineville. He'd been brought there, taken in by someone he was supposed to trust, his uncle, Gordon Stewart Northcott. Even now, there's something unsettling about that part, because danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears familiarity. Sometimes it calls you family. When Sanford first arrived at the ranch, it didn't look like anything out of place. It was dusty, there were chickens, wooden structures that creaked in the heat. It wasn't welcoming, exactly, but it wasn't threatening either, at least not at first. And that's how it began. Not with something obvious, not with violence, but with control. Control has a way of building slowly. It doesn't announce itself. It tests the edges first. Pushes a little here, a little bit there, until resistance starts to feel pointless. Until silence becomes easier than speaking. And on that ranch, silence was everywhere. Sanford learned quickly what was expected of him, what he could say, what he couldn't, what would happen if he stepped outside of those boundaries. Because Northcott didn't just rely on fear, he relied on isolation, on confusion, on breaking someone down piece by piece until they didn't trust their own thoughts anymore, until reality itself felt unstable. There were other boys. That's something Sanford would later describe in fragments, never all at once, never in a clean, linear way, because trauma doesn't tell stories in a straight line. It circles, it stutters, it leaves gaps, and those gaps sometimes say more than words do. He remembered faces, not always clearly, but enough to know they had been there, enough to know they were gone, and no one came looking for them there. No one stood at the edge of that property and demanded answers, because no one knew where to look. That's the part that sits heavy. Not just what happened on that ranch, but how long it was allowed to happen. Northcott had created a world where he controlled everything inside its boundaries. Who came, who stayed, who left. And for the ones who didn't leave, there was no record, no trace, no proof they had ever been there at all, except for Sanford. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment he decided to survive, because survival in a place like that isn't one decision. It's a series of small ones. Stay quiet here, watch carefully there, endure just a little longer, and somewhere along the way, he held on to something that didn't break. But survival comes with a cost, because staying alive in that environment meant witnessing things no one should ever have to carry. It meant understanding what was happening without being able to stop it. It meant existing inside a nightmare while the rest of the world moved on, completely unaware. And eventually, it meant speaking. When Sanford finally spoke about the ranch, about Northcott, about the boys, it didn't land softly. It didn't come across as something people could easily dismiss, because there was something in the way he said it, something raw, something real, the kind of truth that doesn't need perfect details to be believed. And once it was spoken, it couldn't be taken back. The sun was already bleeding out behind the hills the first time those boys crossed onto that ranch. It was 1928, and there was nothing about that place that asked for a second look. Rows of wire coops, a rickety white house, the smell of feathers and dry earth thick in the air. It looked like every other farm on that road. But once those doors swung shut behind them, what it looked like stopped mattering. Because what happened on that land wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, one child at a time. Gordon didn't just snatch him screaming off the street. He was smoother than that. Soft-spoken, a boyish face that made parents trust him. He offered rides and work, a few coins for feeding some chickens, maybe even a little adventure. And the boys, lonely or curious, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time, climbed into his car, thinking they were going somewhere better. Take Walter Collins, 9 years old, March 10th, 1928. His mother gave him a dime that morning. A dime for the movies in Lincoln Heights. He never made it inside. However it happened, a friendly voice, a reason that sounded just believable enough. Walter got inside of a car, and somewhere out past the city, he ended up on that ranch. The same ranch where, for months already, Gordon had been abusing his own nephew, 13-year-old Sanford Clark, or the Winslow brothers, Lewis 12, Nelson 10. May 16th, 1928. They just left their model yacht club in Pomona, walking home in the late afternoon light. A car rolled up beside them. A quick conversation. A friendly offer. They got in, and they never came home. Their parents would get letters later saying that the boys were fine, saying they didn't want to be found. But the handwriting wasn't right, because the boys had been forced to write them. Every word dictated by the man who took them. And before any of them, there was a boy whose name the record never even settled on. Some called him Alvin Gothia. Some called him Jose Gonzalez. February 1928. He was the first. His body was found in a ditch near La Puente, and what was done to him was as brutal as anything in this story, because Gordon decapitated him. He brought the head back to the ranch, and he made young Sanford burn it and crush what was left, so no one could ever name him. A boy made to destroy the proof of another boy's murder. That alone tells you what this place had become. Because once a child crossed that fence line, the ranch showed what it really was. This was a place Gordon chose, on purpose, out past the edge of town, on a dirt road, the nearest neighbor too far away to hear anything the wind might carry. No streetlights, no passerbys, just wire coops, a low white house, and a man who built every board of it, knowing exactly what he meant to use it for. The coops weren't only for chickens. That's where he kept them. The boys that he took were held out there, among the wire and the wood, and the stink of feathers and waste. Some of them on cots, dragged right into the coops, kept like livestock, on the same dirt as the birds. An isolated yard, a locked world where a child could scream, and the only thing that would answer was the sounds of hens shifting in the dark. And Gordon didn't kill them right away, because for the boys he meant to murder, there were days in between, not months, not hours, days, sometimes the better part of a week. Days where a child was just kept out there, alive, waiting, while the man who took him came and went as he pleased. Walter Collins was held for days before he died, long enough that Gordon's own mother drove out for a visit and found the boy still alive in one of those coops, which is the very thing that got him killed. Imagine that stretch of time. A 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, kept in a chicken coop on a ranch he'd never find his way home from, beginning to understand slowly, hour after hour, that no one is coming to save him. And what was done to those boys in those days is the reason the ranch existed at all. Gordon raped the boys he took. That was the purpose of the ranch, not the chickens, not farming. A grown man built himself an isolated compound for the single reason of having children out there that he could assault where no one would ever walk in. Some boys he abused and then drove them back towards home and let them go, like nothing had happened. And those boys lived. The others, the ones he decided had seen too much, the ones he simply chose to keep, those boys never left that ranch alive. And when he was finished with one of them, the killing was done with an axe. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. Walter Collins was killed with the blunt end of the axe as he lay on a cot in one of those coops. And he wasn't killed by Gordon alone, because by the account that came out later, Sarah Louise struck the first blow herself, and then she made her son, and she made Sanford strike him too, so that all three of them would be equally guilty, so that none of them would ever turn on the others. The Winslow brothers died in the same way, in the same place, and the younger one had to watch his brother be murdered right in front of him, knowing he was next. And the bodies didn't rest where they fell. They were buried on the property in a shallow grave and doused in quicklime, the kind that eats the flesh from the bone. And sick, dying chickens were thrown on top to cover the smell of what was underneath. And it was Sanford, more often than not, who was made to dig. But even that wasn't the end of it. Because when the law finally began closing in that September, Gordon and his mother went out to those graves in the dead of the night, and they dug those boys back up. They hauled what was left out into the desert, and they burned it until almost nothing remained. So when investigators finally searched that ground, they didn't find any bodies. They found fragments, a few small bones, the barest trace that these children had ever existed at all. That is what the chicken ranch in Wineville really was. Not a farm, a place where boys were taken and erased. But there's one more person who lived inside that day after day and didn't die. Sanford. And I want you to understand something about what Gordon did to him, because it wasn't only cruelty, it was strategy. Gordon understood that a boy who's just afraid might still talk, but a boy who's been made to take part, a boy carrying his own guilt, well, that boy stays quiet forever. And that's why he made him dig. That's why he made him burn what was left of that first boy. That's why he put an axe in his hands, not because he needed the help, because a witness can testify, but an accomplice can't. He wasn't building a workforce out at that ranch. He was building a cage, and he made Sanford help build it piece by piece around himself. And it almost worked. 2 years. 2 years that boy said nothing, not because he didn't want to, because Gordon had done the math on him and had gotten it right. But here's what Gordon never counted on. The law didn't see it his way. When all of this came out, nobody charged Sanford Clark with anything. They looked at a 15-year-old who'd been beaten, raped, and threatened with his own death, and they saw exactly what he was. He was a victim that the cage didn't hold, a boy made part of horrors he was powerless to stop. The law understood that. When all of this finally came to light, Sanford wasn't treated as a killer. He was treated as what he was, a victim, coerced into things no child should ever survive, by a man who used guilt as a cage. But understanding it doesn't undo it. Sanford carried every piece of that, the abuse, the graves, the things he was forced to do for the rest of his life. And he carried it a long way. He lived into his 60s, back home in Canada, far from that ranch. But you don't ever really leave a place like that. You just learn to live beside it. That is what Sanford Clark carried inside him when he finally broke his silence. And that is what the authorities were about to dig up from the dry earth of Wineville. You know that feeling when something's been sitting just beneath the surface for far too long, like everyone's been walking around it, stepping over it, living their lives, and then suddenly someone points at it and you can't unsee it anymore. That's what this moment feels like, because up until now, everything we've talked about, it's been shadows. It's been pieces, a boy's voice, a place that didn't feel right, a man who didn't quite fit. But this is where it stops being a feeling. This is where it becomes real. And here's the part people don't always realize about how this finally broke open. Sanford didn't escape. No one escaped that ranch. What happened was smaller than that. quieter than that, and somehow harder to bear. His sister came to visit. Her name was Jessie, 19 years old. She came down from Canada in August of 1928, worried about the little brother she hadn't seen in 2 years, worried about his letters. Something in them just wasn't right. She was right to worry. Sanford was 15 by then, and Gordon made sure the two of them were never alone. Not once. He watched the two of them like a hawk. But Jessie kept at it, and somewhere in those few days, she got the truth out of her brother. That Gordon had been beating him, that Gordon had been abusing him, that Gordon had killed 4 boys. And then Jessie did something I still can't quite believe. She confronted him. A 19-year-old girl, alone, on an isolated ranch. She looked a serial killer in the eyes and asked him what he was doing to her brother, and Gordon went for her throat. He drove her to the floor, got his hands around her neck, and started to squeeze. The only reason Jessie Clark walked off that ranch alive is that Sarah Louise ran in and pulled her son off of her. She fled back to Canada, and she didn't let it go. She went to the American consul and told them everything. She wrote to the Los Angeles police, and because Sanford was Canadian, sitting on a ranch in California, it became a question for immigration. That was the crack in everything. On August 31st, 1928, 2 immigration inspectors drove out to Wineville. Picture it, not like a movie, like it actually was. Dry land stretching out in every direction. Heat pressing down until everything feels heavier than it should. Dust in your clothes, your throat, your lungs. Quiet out there. Too quiet. Not peaceful, but empty. But Gordon saw them coming. That road to the ranch was long, and he watched 2 men drive up it, and he knew. So he told Sanford to stall them, and then he told him what would happen if he didn't, that he'd be watching from the tree line with a rifle, and he'd shoot the boy right where he stood. So Sanford ran. And for the next 2 hours, that 15-year-old boy stood in the yard and made small talk with the 2 federal agents, while the man who'd spent 2 years destroying him watched from the trees with a gun. 2 hours. And then something shifted, because at some point in those 2 hours, Sanford decided these men could actually protect him, and so he told them everything. And then he led them to the ground. And here's what should have given it away, but didn't. Nothing about that place looked wrong. Chickens, wire, wooden buildings, tools set down where someone had used them. A working farm. That's all. You could stand in the middle of it and see nothing at all. So they started digging. Fragments, pieces, bone that had no business being in that dirt. Sanford wasn't lying. Not about the boys. Not about what happened out there. Not about Gordon. And that changes everything. Because now it's not a strange story anymore. It's not a possibility. It's a crime scene. And this is what I keep coming back to. This didn't happen all at once. It wasn't one moment. It wasn't a mistake. It was time. 2 years of it, where this just continued. Where nobody stepped in. Where boys disappeared and the world kept moving. That land wasn't just where something happened. It was where something was allowed to continue happening. But by the time those inspectors reached the coops, Gordon was already gone, north, running for Canada, which tells you something. It means he knew. Somewhere in there, he knew the quiet wasn't going to hold. So now, it's a manhunt. But before they find him, before anyone answers for any of this, there's one more thing that has to come out. Because Gordon didn't do this alone. And the person standing next to him is the last person you'd expect. There's a story coming that I haven't been able to shake. And it doesn't start with a victim or a killer. It starts with a thing. Somewhere out in the New Mexico desert, there's a trailer. From the outside, nothing. Just metal, dust, and heat. But the inside was built, soundproofed, outfitted, arranged with the kind of care that most people save for something they love. One man made it with his own hands for one purpose, in a place where no sound ever reached the road. Here's why this story shifts in a way that I don't think people expect. Because up to this point, it's easy, if that's even the right word, to place all of this on one person, one man, one ranch, one source of everything that went wrong. But the truth is, it doesn't stay that simple. It never really does. Because Gordon wasn't the only one connected to what was happening on that property. There was someone else, someone older, someone who should have known better, someone who, by every definition, should have been the one to stop it. His mother, Sarah Louise Northcott. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because when we talk about cases like this, there's usually this instinct to believe that somewhere someone would step in, someone would notice, someone would interrupt it, someone would say this isn't right. But what happens when the person who should have been that voice isn't? Sarah wasn't living at the ranch full time. She was in Los Angeles, which is about an hour away, separated by distance, at least physically. But distance doesn't always mean absence. And in this case, it didn't mean innocent either. Because by the account that came out later, it was Sarah Louise who might have set the worst of it in motion. She came to visit the ranch while Walter Collins was being held there, and she found him. And instead of doing the one thing a person is supposed to do when they find a terrified captive child, she decided he'd seen too much, that he could identify her son, and they had to be silenced. Sanford testified that it was Sarah Louise who decided all three of them should take part in killing Walter, so that none of them could ever turn on each other. That it was Sarah Louise who chose the method. Afraid a gunshot would carry into the neighbors, she struck the first blows herself. And when authorities finally brought her in, there wasn't the kind resistance you might expect. She talked. She confessed. She pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Collins. There's something deeply unsettling about that, because this wasn't a bystander who simply failed to act. This was an active participant, the very person who, by every instinct we carry, should have protected those children. Instead, she helped end their lives. Maybe that's what makes this part feel heavier than the rest, Because now we're not just talking about one man's violence. We're talking about a family that closed ranks around it. The absence of protection, the absence of interruption, the absence of anyone stepping in when it mattered the most. And all of this is unfolding while something else is still hanging in the air, something unresolved. Walter Collins. Because remember, his story is still sitting there, still incomplete, still unanswered. Because up until now, the system that had already tried to close that door had already handed Christine Collins a boy and told her, "This is your son." Because what if the truth was something else entirely? And suddenly, this case isn't just about Wineville anymore. It stretches, it connects, it reaches into Los Angeles, to a mother who never stopped saying something was wrong, into a system that refused to listen. And I keep coming back to that idea, cracks. Because this entire case feels like it lived in the spaces that people didn't look too closely at. The assumptions, the rushed conclusions, the moments where it was easier to accept an answer than to question it. But now, there's no looking away. Because the story has outgrown containment. It's too big, too visible, too undeniable. And when he's finally found, when everything catches up to him, there's a moment where everything that's been hidden, everything that's been denied, everything that's been buried is forced into the open. And what comes next isn't just about what he did, it's about what he admits to and what he doesn't. You ever notice how when someone's been hiding something for a long time, the truth doesn't come out clean? It doesn't just land all at once, clear and solid. It slips, it shifts, it changes shape depending on who's asking and what they already know. That's exactly what happens here. Because when Gordon is finally caught, run to ground in Canada and brought back across the border, there isn't a big dramatic moment where everything suddenly makes sense. There's no clean confession, no neat explanation that ties it all together. But what you get instead is something a lot more unsettling. You get pieces, because Northcott talks, but he never tells the story the same way twice. One moment, he admits to things, and the next, he pulls back, denies it, changes details, shifts numbers. At one point, he said he killed 19 boys. Then he changed it to 5. Then another time, the number climbed back up towards 20. By the end, no one can say for certain how many there really were, because the only person who knew kept moving the truth around like it was a game. Imagine being in that room, sitting across from somebody like that, knowing what's been found, knowing what Sanford said, knowing what his own mother admitted to, and still not being able to get a straight answer. That's the part that lingers. Not just what he did, but how he carried it, how casually he moved in and out of the truth, like it didn't matter, like the weight of it didn't sit on him the way that it should. But here's the thing, by this point, the evidence doesn't rely on him anymore. The ranch already spoke. Sanford already spoke. The land already gave back what it could. So his words, they don't carry the same power they might have earlier. Now they just complicate things. And then there's the part that keeps circling back. Walter Collins. Because no matter how much Northcott talks, no matter how many versions he gives, there's never a clear, undeniable answer. And that absence, it's loud. Because for Christine Collins, this isn't about headlines. It's not about the investigation or courtrooms. It's about her son. And while the world starts to piece together what happened at that ranch, she's still standing in the middle of it, asking the same question she asked from the beginning. Where's my boy? And that's something I want you to really, really, truly sit with. Because sometimes the truth isn't just about what's proven. It's about what's left unresolved. But even without every answer, there's enough. More than enough. Enough to bring this into a courtroom. Enough to move forward. Enough to make sure that what happened in Wineville doesn't stay buried out there in that dry, forgotten land. You think this is the part where everything settles, where the story finally slows down, where all the pieces come together in a way that makes sense, where there's a clear ending. But that's not how this one works, because when the trial begins, it doesn't feel like closure. It feels like pressure. All of it. Everything we walk through gets pulled into one room. The ranch, Sanford's voice, the evidence that came out of that land, the shifting, inconsistent words of Gordon Stewart Northcott. It's all there, and it doesn't sit neatly. It weighs on the room. And at the center of it all is a man who still won't give them a straight line. Because here's what Gordon does. He fires his lawyers. He decides to represent himself. He calls himself to the witness stand. And then he questioned himself, asking the questions, then answering them, turning one of the most horrific murder trials in California history into a performance. He admits to abusing young boys. He said he loved them. He smiles, grandstands for the jury, enjoys the attention, the control. But while Gordon's story changes, Sanford's doesn't. Through cross-examination, through fear, through the weight of being the first person willing to speak, his accounts remain the same. And when everything else feels unstable, consistency becomes its own kind of truth. So when the verdict comes, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels inevitable. Gordon Stewart Northcott is found guilty, sentenced to death. And despite every performance he'd given, every attempt to appear fearless, when that day finally arrived, Gordon Northcott was terrified to die. They found him shaking in his cell at San Quentin. He had to be helped to the gallows. And when they hanged him on October 2nd, 1930, the rope didn't break his neck the way it was supposed to. It took him 13 minutes to die. The man who had stolen so much time from others left this world slowly himself. And even then, he left one final lie behind. He claimed there were more bodies buried somewhere else. Investigators searched. They found nothing. One last attempt to control the story, even in death. For most cases, this is where the ending would be. The verdict, the sentence, the execution, case closed. But Wineville was never really that simple, because Gordon carried parts of the truth with him. Whether he confessed to everything, or whether he buried pieces of it forever, we'll never know. And that uncertainty left something no courtroom could resolve. Walter Collins. Christine Collins never stopped believing her son was out there, whether Walter died at Wineville or somewhere else entirely. There's never been a definitive answer. That question followed her for the rest of her life, and it still follows this case today. Then there's the ranch itself. The chicken coops are long gone, but the original house still stands. Someone lives there now, on an ordinary street, in a town that doesn't even carry the name Wineville anymore. Every so often, the people who've lived there or nearby tell remarkably similar stories. A knock at the door, with no one there. A feeling that something doesn't belong. There's even a story that during production of the film that's based on this case, that the couple living in the house moved out after learning what had happened on that property. Can I verify that? No. I'm not going to pretend I can either. These aren't police reports. They're not evidence. They're simply the kind of stories that collect around places marked by extraordinary tragedy. Believe them or don't, Wineville doesn't need ghost stories to be haunted. The haunting isn't a sound in an empty house. It's an absence. 3 boys were buried on that property before investigators arrived. Their bodies were dug up under the cover of darkness, taken into the desert, burned until almost nothing remained. When detectives searched the ranch, they didn't recover children. They recovered fragments, small pieces of bone, not enough to bring home, not enough to bury, not enough to return a son to his family. Those boys were taken twice, once from the world and once from the earth itself. That is what haunts this place. Not a presence, the absence, the empty space where graves should have been. The answers Christine Collins spent the rest of her life searching for. The children whose names history remembers, but whose resting places it never will. Even the town tried to leave it behind. Wineville became Mariloma, a different name, a different map, as though changing the sign at the end of the town could somehow soften what happened there. But names don't erase history. They only make it quieter, because at the end of all of this, there's still one question. How many? Not the number prosecutors could prove. The number no one will ever know. How many children were never found? How many families never got answers? And if Sanford Clark hadn't finally spoken, if Jessie Clark hadn't listened, how much longer would the silence have lasted? And that's the part that should sit with all of us. Not just what happened in Wineville, but how long it was allowed to happen before anyone was willing to see it. I keep thinking about the stillness, not the kind that feels peaceful. The kind that settles in after everyone else has gone home, after the headlines fade, after the courtroom empties, after the world decides it's time to move on. Because stories like this don't really end. People simply stop talking about them. The crowds disappear. The attention moves somewhere else. But the places, the families, the questions, they stay exactly where they were. Wineville changed its name. The roads were paved. The ranch became part of an ordinary neighborhood. Life moved on, but history didn't. And I can't help wondering how many people have walked that ground since then, never realizing what happened beneath their feet. Or maybe they did know and just chose not to think about it, because it's easier to believe evil belongs to another time, another place, another person. But this story was never only about Gordon Northcott. It was about what happens when cruelty is allowed to exist unnoticed, when the warning signs are ignored, when the truth survives only because one frightened boy finally found the courage to speak and someone believed him. If Sanford Clark had stayed silent, if Jessie Clark never turned him away, how much longer would it have continued? And then there's Walter Collins, the question the story could never answer, whether he died at Wineville or somewhere else. The truth disappeared with the man who knew it, leaving Christine to spend the rest of her life searching for an ending she never received. Sometimes, closure never comes. Maybe that's the darkest part of this case. Not what we know, but what we never will. The names we'll never learn. The children who may never have been found. The pieces of the story that vanished forever. So, when this episode ends, don't think of Wineville as a story that's over. Think of it as one that was uncovered, just enough to remind us how much can still remain hidden. Because darkness doesn't always disappear when you shine the light on it. Sometimes it simply waits. There's always a part of every story that goes untold, not because it isn't there, but because no one was left to speak for it. Those are the pieces that stay with me, the ones you can't prove, the ones you can't finish, the ones that refuse to let history become comfortable. If this case lingers a little longer than the others, maybe that's why. Some stories don't end, they echo. The next time we step into the dark, we'll meet a man who looked painfully ordinary. He held down a job, his neighbors knew him, while everyone around him believed they knew exactly who he was. He was quietly building something no human being ever should. A place he called the Toy Box. Until one woman escaped and finally told the world what had been hidden behind its doors. If you haven't already, follow Chasing the Dark so you don't miss what's waiting next. And if these stories stay with you just a little longer, share the show or leave a rating and a review. It helps bring more people into the conversation, because these stories deserve to be remembered. Some monsters don't stumble into the dark, they build it. Thank you for listening to Chasing the Dark. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep looking closer, because sometimes the darkest truths are hiding in plain sight.